Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on ISO 13485-2016. Are you ready for this? My name is Shannon Craddock, and I'm the Programs and Accreditations Manager at Perry Johnson Registrars, and delighted to have you here today. This is one of the first times that we'll be presenting this content. We've participated in the same presentation in a different forum, so we're still working out the kinks and welcome your feedback. To ensure sound quality, all participants have been muted. If you have a question, please type the question into the question or chat feature, and at the end of the prepared content, I'll answer as many questions as I can. Today's webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and a recording of the webinar will be available within 24 to 48 hours after the webinar completes. And that can be accessed through www.pjr.com. At that same address, you'll be able to see a listing of upcoming webinars, some great content coming on SQF Edition 8, what to expect during your Stage 1 audit, and our root cause corrective action seminar. So today we'll be talking about the transition requirements, who mandates the rules, and what those specific rules are, including timing. We'll go through an overview of any changed, new, or deleted requirements, and there's not a lot of deletions, to be honest, and then there'll be time for Q&A after. So first, let's talk about the transition requirements. ANAB, the accreditation body, which is based in the United States, has published Heads Up 340, and anyone can access that through the ANAB website. And this heads up relates to the transition process for both CBs and clients of certification bodies. The revised ISO 1345 was published on the 1st of March 2016, and IAF Resolution 2015-13 details a transition period of 3 years from the date of publication. Certification bodies, including PJR, have to apply to transition our accreditation from the 2003 version of 13485 to the 2016 version. Once we're approved, we'll be able to issue certificates to 13485-2016. In the interim, we are able to conduct audits, provided our auditors are trained to the new version of 13485. And our auditors are going through that training process now. Some have already completed it. I would expect all other auditors to complete the training no later than mid-October. So let's start with an overview of changed, new, and deleted requirements, beginning in section 0.1. And this is not a normative section, but it includes some important changes. And section 0.1 provides more detail regarding the types of organizations that are covered by 13485-2016 and the life cycle stages in the medical device manufacturing process that are covered. Regarding life cycle stages, it indicates that organizations involved in design and development, as well as production, but storage and distribution, installation, servicing, final decommissioning, and disposal of medical devices, and the design, development, and provision of associated activities. All of these are included in the scope of 13485. Previously, this wasn't made clear, although many different types of organizations, as opposed to traditional legal manufacturers, were pursuing certification. Now it just makes it clear. Organizations that are applicable: suppliers or external parties providing product, including raw materials, components, subassemblies, medical devices themselves, sterilization services, calibration, distribution, and maintenance services are now applicable. Some additional requirements in section 0.1. 1345 requires the organization to identify its role under applicable regulatory requirements. And we'll find out what the options are regarding identification of role. And then once you've identified your role, you're now required to identify the regulatory requirements that apply to its activities under these roles and incorporate these applicable regulatory requirements within your medical device quality management system. More on this in a few minutes. Section 0.2, entitled Clarification of Concepts, states that as appropriate, whenever you see as appropriate in the standard, in the normative requirements, is deemed to be appropriate unless you can justify otherwise. Keep in mind, however, that a requirement is considered appropriate if it's necessary for you to comply with applicable regulatory requirements or for you to manage risks. Then it always has to be appropriate. They clarify that use of the word risk pertains to safety or performance requirements of the medical device or meeting applicable regulatory requirements. Also in section 0.2, if something's documented, it's understood to mean established, implemented, and maintained, and product should also be understood to mean service. In 0.3, again, not a normative requirement, but some additional requirements were added to really drive the process approach to quality management. Organization is required to understand and meet requirements, consider process in terms of added value, obtain results of process performance and effectiveness, and then improve your processes based on objective measurement. So understand what your processes are. Are they meaningful? Do they make sense within the way your organization operates and aren't just named because they're process headings in the standard? Do they make sense for your organization in terms of added value? Are you monitoring at minimum and measuring whenever possible these processes and then taking the data that you get, and are you reacting to those data and improving processes based on the measurements you're seeing? Section 1, scope, again reiterates the expanded applicability of the standard in terms of the life cycle stages and inclusion of suppliers and external parties as being applicable. Clarify that outsourced processes are the responsibility of the organization and are to be accounted for in the organization's QMS by monitoring, maintaining, and controlling the process. Clarifies that requirements in Section 6 and 8 as well as 7 can be justified as non-applicable. So previously it was just Section 7, now this opens it up to Section 6 and 8. And again, that second bullet point is really important. Just because something is outsourced, the organization that's seeking certification to 1345 is still responsible for those outsourced processes. You need to manage your supplier. There are a lot of new terms and definitions in Section 3. And I could do an entire 1-hour webinar on just the new terms and definitions. We're just covering a few of the most important ones here. Starting with 3.2, authorized representative. This is the natural or legal person established within a country or jurisdiction who has received a written mandate from the manufacturer to act on his or her behalf for specified tasks with regard to the manufacturer's obligations under that country or jurisdiction's legislation. Section 3.4, complaint. I've chosen to focus on this definition because the 1345-2016 definition of complaint is different than the 9001 definition of a complaint. And it's the written, electronic, or oral communication that alleges deficiencies related to the identity, quality, durability, reliability, usability, safety, or performance of a medical device that has been released from the organization's control, or related to a service that affects the performance of such medical devices. So again, a very specific definition related to 1345-2016. Okay, we talked about an authorized representative as being one of the roles an organization can assume. The next would be a distributor. A distributor is the natural or legal person in the supply chain who, on his own behalf, furthers the availability of the medical device to the end user. It's perfectly appropriate for there to be more than one in the supply chain. And it's also important to understand that people involved in storage, transport activities on behalf of the manufacturer, importer, or distributor are not distributors under this definition. This is the natural legal person in the supply chain who, on his or her own behalf, furthers the availability of the medical device to the end user. An importer is another role, and it's the natural or legal person in the supply chain who is the first in the supply chain to make a medical device manufactured in another country or jurisdiction available in the country or jurisdiction where it's being marketed. And the final definition we're going to go through is 310, manufacturer. This is the natural legal person with responsibility for design or manufacture of a medical device with the intention of making the medical device available for use under his name, whether or not such a medical device is designed and or manufactured by that person himself or on his behalf by other persons. So if the device is under somebody's name, they're considered the manufacturer. They can choose to outsource the manufacturer, but if it's being sold under their name, they're deemed the manufacturer. It's important to note that there are numerous notes, clarifying notes, in 1345-2016 clarifying what the role of a manufacturer is. And because of the new requirement to define your role and define the applicable regulatory requirements, it's important that you read those notes and make an appropriate decision about your role. An interesting change as we get into some of the normative requirements now. The italicized font used in 1345-2003 to call out medical device specific requirements is no longer used. So 411, as we now get into some of the normative requirements, the organization needs to document the role or roles undertaken by the organization under the applicable regulatory requirements. So you have to identify as a manufacturer, an authorized representative, an importer, or a distributor. (412A) states that the organization needs to determine the processes needed for the quality management system and the application of these processes throughout the organization, taking into account the roles undertaken by the organization. So again, this is the process approach. Determine your processes and the application of these processes, but keeping in mind the role you undertake. And then 412B says, apply a risk-based approach to the control of these processes that you've determined are needed for your medical device quality management system. 414A through C states that changes to QMS processes shall be evaluated for their impact on the quality management system, evaluated for their impact on the medical device, and controlled in accordance with 1345 and regulatory requirements. So if you're changing a process, you need to evaluate how it impacts your QMS overall and how it impacts any of the medical devices. There's certainly maybe some changes that don't impact the medical device at all. Section 415 relates to outsourcing. If an organization makes a business decision to outsource a process that affects product conformity, you need to monitor and control the process. As a certified entity, you're ultimately responsible for that outsourced process. You are responsible for conformity of 13 to 1345-2016 and any customer or applicable regulatory requirements. You are the responsible entity, not the outsourced supplier. And the controls that you flow down to your supplier need to be proportionate to the risk involved and the ability of the external party to meet requirements. So obviously, if that external party is 1345-2016 certified, maybe audited by you, audited by regulatory authorities, then the level of control that you may flow down in a written quality agreement may be less. So it's going to depend on the risk and the level of control that you have. But some of your controls need to include written quality agreements. So again, a risk-based approach here. Depending what you outsource and the risk associated with that, the level of control should be proportionate. 416 talks about validating computer software. Software needs to be validated prior to use and then in response to changes in the software or its application. The approach for the revalidation process needs to be proportionate to the risk associated with the use of the software, and you need to maintain records with any software validation or revalidation. Section 423 talks about a medical device file, and for each medical device or medical device family, you need to establish and maintain a file that contains or references certain documents required by 1345 or the applicable regulatory requirements. And the file should contain a general description of the device, including its intended use or purpose, labeling and instructions for use, the specifications of the product, specifications or procedures for manufacturing, packaging, storage, handling, and distribution, procedures for measuring and monitoring, requirements for installation and servicing as appropriate. Section 424 relating to control of documents. A procedure has always been required, but this procedure needs to address preventing deterioration or loss of documents. That's the new requirement. And the new requirement in 425, the organization is required to define and implement methods for protecting confidential PII or PHI, personal identifiable information, or personal health information contained in records in accordance with regulatory requirements. So if your device is such that you're going to have some personal identifiable information or personal health information, you need to have a process for protecting this information. 5.6 management review. A new requirement here to document procedures for management review. Top management must review the QMS at documented planned intervals. So those are the two new requirements. A procedure, which wasn't required before, and then top management must review the QMS at documented planned intervals. New inputs to management review include feedback. Previously this was just customer feedback. Now you have to include feedback from many other sources, complaint handling and reporting to regulatory authorities. All of those need to be covered in management review. 6.2, human resources. The organization must document a process for establishing competence, providing needed training, and ensuring awareness of personnel. So requirement for a documented process here. 6.3, infrastructure. The organization must document the requirements for the infrastructure needed to prevent product mix-up and ensure orderly handling of product. Infrastructure has been opened up to include information systems. And the maintenance requirement was clarified to be applicable to equipment used in production, controlling the work environment, and monitoring and measurement. All that equipment needs to be maintained. (641) work environment. The organization shall document the requirements for the work environment needed to achieve conformity to product requirements. So we're seeing here a lot of requirements for documentation. Not necessarily documented procedures, but documentation of requirements. And that can take many forms, procedure being just one way. Contamination control. For sterile medical devices, the organization must document requirements for control of contamination with microorganisms or particulate matter and maintain required cleanliness throughout assembly and packaging. Moving into Section 7.1b, Planning of Product Realization. The organization needs to provide resources specific to the product, including infrastructure and work environment. So in the planning of the realization process, the organization needs to make sure that they've got the infrastructure and work environment capable. The organization in the planning stages also needs to determine the required handling, storage, distribution, and traceability activities. Section 7.2, Customer-Related Processes, looking at 7.2.1, Determination of Requirements Related to Product. The organization has to determine any user training needed to ensure the specified performance and safe use of the medical device. So this is a new requirement, determining user training needed. 7.2.2, Review of Requirements Related to the Product. This review has to occur prior to the organization's commitment to supply product to the customer and ensure that applicable regulatory requirements are met and any user training previously identified is or will be available. So some interesting changes in Section 7.3 Design. Here we're going to see a deletion and then as well as many added requirements, new requirements. 7.3.2 Design and Development Planning. During the planning stages, the organization has to document what the review stages are going to be, the methods to ensure traceability of design and development outputs to design and development inputs, how they're going to ensure that the outputs meet all the input requirements, and the resources that they're going to need for the project, including the competence of personnel. In the 2003 version, there was a requirement for management of interfaces, and this has been eliminated. Design and development inputs. Inputs relating to product requirements must be determined and records maintained. They clarify that a new input is usability requirements, and they clarify that requirements shall be able to be verified or validated. So through the outputs, looking at the outputs through the verification or validation process, we need to see that they're all being met. Design and development review. Now in your planning stages, you're going to determine where design reviews are needed. This requirement is telling you that design review records must include the identification of the design under review. That makes sense. Who was involved and the date the review was conducted. 7.3.6 Design and Development Verification. Organizations required to document the verification plans that include the methods used, what the acceptance criteria are, and as appropriate, statistical techniques with rationale for sampling size, if it's appropriate to employ those techniques. When the intended use of the medical device requires a connection or interface with maybe another component, then the verification has to include confirmation that the design output meets the input requirements when it is in fact connected or interface maybe with another piece of hardware or software or another component. The records of the results and the conclusions of the verification and any necessary actions resulting have to be maintained. 737 talks about design and development validation. The organization is required to document validation plans that include methods, acceptance criteria, and as appropriate statistical techniques with rationale for sample size. Again, it's going to depend on the type of medical device and the quantity of devices. So the requirement for validation here mirrors the requirement for verification we saw on the prior slide. You have to rationalize the choice of product used for validation and record that. Again, very similar to verification, when the intended use of the medical device requires connection or interface with another device or unit or hardware or software, the validation shall include confirmation that outputs are meeting input requirements when that connection or interface is functional. And the records of the validation efforts and any resulting actions have to be maintained. New requirement for design or development transfer, and this is going to ensure the transition from the design engineering stage to the manufacturing stage. The organization has to document a procedure for transfer of the design and development outputs to manufacturing. The procedure has to cover outputs are verified as suitable for manufacturing before final production specs, and that production capability can meet product requirements. Results, conclusions of transfer shall be recorded. So interesting requirement here for a procedure. And as I stated before, lots of additional requirements for documented procedures or documented information in 1345-2016, which is really getting away from the trend we're seeing in 9001-2015, and even so with ISO 1345-2003. (739) Control of design and development changes. The organization must determine the significance of the change to the function, performance, usability, safety, and applicable regulatory requirements for the device and its intended use. And any design and development changes shall include evaluation of the effect of the changes on constituent parts, WIP, delivered product, inputs, outputs of risk management, and the product realization process. So the impact must be evaluated. New requirement 7310, design and development files. The organization has to maintain a design and development file for each medical device or medical device family. The file must include a reference records generated to demonstrate conformity to the requirements for design and development, and include a reference records for design and development changes. Moving on to section 7.4, purchasing. 7.4.1 talks about the purchasing process. New criteria for evaluation and selection of suppliers. And the criteria for evaluation and selection has to be based on the performance of the supplier and be proportionate to the risk associated with the medical device. So obviously the criteria must be rigorous when we have a new or maybe poorly performing supplier performing a high-risk service or providing a high-risk component. The organization needs to plan the monitoring and reevaluation of the supplier, including their ability to meet requirements for purchased product. Results of monitoring shall be an input to the supplier reevaluation process, which makes sense. You're collecting data on supplier performance that needs to flow back into your supplier evaluation loop. Non-fulfillment of purchasing requirements needs to be handled based on the risk associated with the purchased product and compliance with applicable regulatory requirements. A high-risk component that impacts the integrity of the device obviously needs to be treated in a certain way and with more risk, more weight than a lower risk component or a lower risk service. Records related to selection, monitoring, and reevaluation of suppliers has to be maintained. Purchasing information must include, as applicable, a written agreement that the supplier notifies the organization of any changes in the purchased product or service prior to implementation, of any changes that's going to affect the ability of the purchased product to meet specified requirements. So the organization needs to be identified in advance of the change being made. When the organization becomes aware of any changes to the purchased product, so this follows up nicely, the organization must determine whether these changes impact the product realization process or the medical device. So if it's a supplier-initiated change, they have to notify you, and as a certified organization, you have to evaluate whether these changes impact the product realization process or the medical device itself. 752, cleanliness of product. The organization shall document requirements for cleanliness of product or contamination control of the product if the product cannot be cleaned prior to sterilization or its use, and its cleanliness is of significance in its use. Servicing activities. The organization shall analyze records of servicing activities carried out by the organization or its suppliers to determine if the information gained from the service call should be handled as a complaint and as an input to the improvement process. So if the organization is doing servicing as part of its service and it's learning things, it's learning about issues in the field, these have to flow back to the organization. The organization needs to make a determination whether it needs to be handled as a complaint or not. And all this information needs to input. It needs to serve as an input to the improvement process. (756) has requirements for the organization to document procedures for validation of processes. And these procedures have to include provisions for revalidation and criteria for revalidation and approval of changes to processes. The requirement for a documented procedure for validation of computer software remains, and the approach used has to be proportionate to the risk and the effect on the ability of the product to conform to specifications. Results, conclusions, and any necessary actions resulting from validation activities have to be maintained. 757 has particular requirements for the validation of processes for sterilization and sterile barrier systems. And the concept of a sterile barrier system is first introduced here. Processes need to be validated prior to implementation and following product process changes. Records of results, any conclusions, and any necessary actions resulting from these validation activities have to be maintained. And here we see a reference to ISO 11607-1 and 11607-2. So if you're dealing with sterilization or sterile barrier systems, you'll want to look at those ISO specs. 758 talks to the identification requirements. And if it's required by the regulatory requirements, the organization shall document a system to assign a unique device identification to the individual medical device, only if required. The organization shall document procedures, again a requirement for a documented procedure here to ensure that devices returned to the organization are distinguished from conforming product. 7511 talks about preservation of product. The organization must protect product from alteration, contamination, damage during processing, storage, handling, and distribution by designing and constructing suitable packaging and shipping containers. Documenting requirements for special conditions needed if packaging alone is not sufficient, if there are specified handling or storage requirements. And if special conditions are required, they must be controlled and recorded to prove they're being met. Moving into Section 8, 821 feedback. The organization must document procedures. Again, a requirement for a documented procedure here for a feedback process, including production and post-production activities. The feedback gathered shall be a potential input into risk management for monitoring and maintaining product requirements, as well as the product realization or improvement processes. So you're gathering this information through your feedback processes. Do something with that information. It's now a requirement. It goes into your risk management process and improvement processes. 822 is a brand new section on complaint handling. First, a documented procedure is required for the timely handling of complaints in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. So you need to be sure you're meeting regulatory requirements as well as those defined in 1345/2016. If a determination is made not to investigate a complaint, that needs to be justified and documented. If the investigation reveals that activities outside of the organization contributed to the complaint, maybe a component part or an outsourced service, then the relevant information needs to be exchanged with the involved parties, and records have to be maintained of every step. 823, reporting to regulatory authorities. This is a new requirement that if applicable regulatory requirements require notification of complaints that meet specified reporting criteria of adverse events or issuance of advisory notices, the organization shall document procedures for providing notification to the appropriate regulatory authorities. So if one of these unfortunate events were to occur, what's the process for notifying the applicable regulatory authorities? Who's going to do it? When's it going to be done, etc. And then records of any reporting made to regulatory authorities shall be maintained. 826 talks about monitoring and measuring of product. Your records of product monitoring and measurement need to identify the test equipment used to perform the measurement activities. 8.3 relates to the requirements for non-conforming product. Again, there's still a requirement for a documented procedure. It has to define the responsibilities and authorities for identifying, documenting, segregating, evaluating, and the disposition of non-conforming product. The evaluation that's conducted has to include a determination of the need for an investigation and notification of any external party responsible for the nonconformity, and records of the evaluation, investigation, and rationale for decisions have to be maintained. An interesting distinction is being made between 832 and 833. Actions in response to nonconforming product detected before delivery are covered in 832, separately from actions in response to nonconforming product detected after delivery, which is covered in 833. So let's talk about 832 first. If nonconforming product is accepted by concession, it can be done only if justification is provided, approval is obtained, and the applicable regulatory requirements are met. And for product detected after delivery, the organization shall document procedures for issuing advisory notices in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements, and procedures shall be capable of being implemented at the time. They have to be implemented at the ready. Records need to be maintained. 8.4, analysis of data. The required procedure shall now include determination of appropriate methods, including statistical techniques and the extent of their use. So again, there was always a procedural requirement defining now determination of appropriate methods, including statistical techniques and the extent of their use. The analysis of data needs to include input from audits and service reports as applicable. So all those have to input the results of first, second, third-party audits have to input into your analysis of data process, as well as any service reports if you're doing servicing. Requirements in 852 under corrective action, 853 relating to preventive action need to include a verification that the corrective and preventive action that's chosen to be implemented does not adversely affect the ability of the applicable regulatory to meet applicable regulatory requirements or the safety or performance of the device. So all that needs to be considered when determining appropriate corrective or preventive actions. So these are all, that's all that I have for the prepared content. I know I went through it very quickly, got through it much more quickly than I imagined as one of the first times we're delivering this webinar. Now we'll open up the floor to any questions or comments or concerns that you have. Please type any questions that you have into the chat feature or the question feature, and I'll answer as many of those as I can. Okay, getting a number of questions coming in. I'm going to try to tackle as many of these as I can. First is a really basic question. Is the standard not following Annex SL? Yes, that's correct. The standard in its organization and numbering is not following Annex SL, which many of the ISO standards are now following as they're being rewritten, revised, and released. So it's not going to match the 9001-2015 or the 14001-2015. And this is very likely the reason that the italicized font was also removed. Someone's asking, is it when will companies be required to conform to the new ISO 13485-2016? Early in the presentation, we learned that there's a 3-year transition period. Let's go back to that slide so we can review the stages in detail. So it doesn't have the same 9/14/2018 deadline that ISO 9001-2015 and ISO 14001-2015 have. So the standard published the 1st of March 2016 and a 3-year transition period, so around the 1st of March 2019. Certainly you cannot wait that long to have an audit, so we will probably implement requirements for the last time, a drop-dead date for organizations who are seeking certification for the first time to select 1345-2003 as opposed to 2016, and then a transition deadline for currently certified clients to go through their transition audit. I'm not really seeing, Fred, any inherent or potential conflicts between AS 9100 CD and 1345-2016. If you see those, please provide specifics and we can discuss those. Somebody's asking, is it really necessary to perform on-site audits to a QMS certified supplier? Again, the standard gives you some flexibility there. You need to determine what's appropriate based on risk. We see risk coming up a lot in the standard. So you want to look at that supplier's performance and the impact of what it is that they're doing for you, and how it impacts the medical device. How crucial, how risky is it what they're doing? So it may or may not be necessary based on what it is that supplier is doing for you or providing to you and what their prior performance has been. But to give you a short answer to your question, no, it may not be necessary. Someone's asking, if our company pursues both 9001 2015 and 1345 2016, what does PGR recommend getting first? I really don't have a specific recommendation about what you want to do first. You may want to do them simultaneously. Chances are your audits are done simultaneously to begin with, Andrea. Previously, when 13485-2003 more closely mirrored the requirements of 9001-2008, we were able to add 9001-2008 with very little audit time, perhaps just focusing on non-medical device commodities. Now, with many more changes in 1345-2016 and some differences with 9001-2015, it may not be possible to have such a short 9001 audit. So you may be seeing more audit time, but you could do both audits simultaneously. Somebody's asking more about some of the 7.4 requirements about monitoring and controls on the supplier. Is inspection on delivery sufficient? Yes, inspection on delivery could be sufficient. Again, here, the theme we were seeing in those slides is risk. So you've got to look at your evaluation and monitoring data, and you also have to look at the risk of what's being provided to you. Getting a repeat question, does 1345-2016 focus more on improvement rather than maintenance, as did ISO 1345-2003? Yeah, I mean, we're seeing some improvement, some more improvement references. In 821, for example, looking at various sources of feedback and making sure that those get routed into the risk and improvement processes, looking at service reports and making sure that those get treated as complaints or input to the risk management process. So yeah, I think there's always an increased focus on improvement. I hope that answers your question, Fred. Someone's asking, is it possible to have one set of procedures that combine ISO 9001-2015 and 1345-2016? Sure, that's always possible. You determine procedures that work for you as long as you have documented procedures or documented information to address all requirements. One set may be fine. What if a company, I get this question a lot, what if a company manufactures parts medical devices, not the medical devices themselves? Can exceptions be taken? Exceptions can be taken, Fred, but again, they have to be justified, and those justifications will be evaluated by the auditor. Pete, I'm not understanding your question about 1345-2016. If you could clarify it. Lots of questions coming in, folks. Bear with me. Tony, I don't know what you mean by a training schedule. Getting a question about feedback. To process all kinds of feedback can be a very time-consuming process for a supplier with many customers, especially in view of the necessity to make an evaluation of them. Is there a trick to overcome the workload it could generate? No, unfortunately there's not. Again, the requirement is that not only customer feedback, but all sources of feedback are evaluated and are an input to management review. Previously, it was just customer feedback. So you're going to want to make sure that you have a good process for gathering the data, evaluating it, and drawing conclusions, maybe to streamline what you're presenting in management review. But if you have a lot of customers, you've got a lot of sources of input, there's no shortcut to doing that data analysis. Just reading through the other questions, folks. Currently, PGR does not have any plans to be involved with the medical device single audit program, although that may change, Lisa. Someone's making the assertion ISO 1345 and they're using 2015, it's actually 2016, is based on ISO 9001-2008. Can we request to be certified to 9001-2008 along with 1345? Not sure I agree with it being based on 9001-2008. It certainly doesn't follow the Annex SL format, but you can request simultaneous certification to any version of 9001, 2008, or 2015, and 1345, 2003, or 2016. Based on the fact that 1345, 2016 is not following Annex SL, Sundaram, it may be that additional time is added that wasn't added with earlier versions of those two standards. Copies of today's slides, Dave, will be available for download from our website, www.pjr.com. Tony, thanks for clarifying your training schedule question, auditor training. Do you mean classes, formal classes, multi-day classes for training? PGR does not do any training other than webinars. We have a sister company that's a related body, PJI, that does perform training. I'm not aware if they do any 1345 training. I know they do 9001, 14001 training, but you could check out their website to see what their offerings are. Fred is asking why person and not organization is used in defining roles. It could also be an entity, Fred. I don't know what the rationale is for that term. We won't be distributing copies of the presentation. They'll be available for download. Any other questions? Again, I encourage you to check out our website, www.pjr.com, for information on upcoming webinars and to download copies of the slides and to access a recording of today's webinar. Some additional question coming in. Could you please elaborate on the other possible feedback sources other than customer for management review? Absolutely. Let's go back to that slide. New inputs include feedback, previously customer feedback. So this could include feedback from your suppliers, feedback from the regulatory authority, feedback from your certification body, feedback from other interested parties, feedback from industry or trade associations. I hope that answers your question, Sabrina. Feedback from servicing. Okay, folks, we'll just wait a few more minutes to see if any additional questions come up. Okay, it appears that there's no other questions. I appreciate everybody's time today. I know you're all busy, and we value your participation and welcome your feedback. Thank you very much.